Hello. If this is the first video that you're watching, and it may be because I made the first one optional, thank you for bearing with us while we try to figure out the best way to do everything. Um, I also want to apologize. I have a better camera, but I couldn't get it to connect to my computer, so I'm having to use the lower quality built-in web camera on my laptop. Um, but I'm going to just start with the DSM since I assigned that to you. And I'm going to provide a little bit of history from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a publication of the American Psychiatric Association, and it aims to classify mental disorders according to standardized criteria. The DSM is currently on its fifth edition, which was published in 2013, and it has a history through which it both came into being and changed through the years. Every time a new DSM edition comes out, it represents a shift in the philosophy underlying mental health diagnostics in our society as a whole. I'm going to start in 1917, which is when the American Psychiatric Association developed the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions of the Insane. Um, that's before we had a DSM. And I've read a good bit of this book. It's interesting. And what we see when we look at it is the way that people imagine mental health, which was called mental hygiene at the time, uh, in those days in the early 20th century. There was an assumption then with regard to mental health that there were two fundamental categories that were they were the dominant classifications that were needed to be known. And I want you to remember this. There were sane people and insane people. This manual was written with the assumption that people who are insane should be treated in an institutional setting, and the treatment for a person who was deemed insane was, when compared to today's standards of diagnosis and treatment, very general. The ontological category of insane was seen as the important thing. And when I talk about the sane insane distinction, that's what I'm talking about. The individual sub-diagnoses were all subordinate to that. And this manual was written as a guide for people working within asylums. And when you read it, it's remarkable how much of the manual is made up of administrative data rather than like actually describing the mental disorders themselves, which are not the biggest part of the book. It tells you the names of all the conditions, but it's not like the DSM. Most of the time, you get about one page for a diagnosis, and it's mostly just telling you what the diagnosis is. It doesn't do much to tell you what kind of individualized treatment a person might need because they're suffering from, say, brain tumor induced psychosis versus manic depressive psychosis, which are both in that manual. The manual also includes a listing for not insane, which is used to distinguish patients who have been institutionalized but have been determined to be, for example, alcoholics, but not suffering from alcoholism with psychosis. An entire section of the manual is dedicated to how to determine the race of a patient for administrative purposes. This was considered extremely important at that time. And it's also interesting when you read it to see how race was imagined at that time. For example, Cuban was considered a race, so was Lithuanian. There were lots and lots of different races, and there were instructions on how to determine, for example, whether or not a patient of Caribbean origin should be classified as black or West Indian, or whether or not a person who you can't really tell should be classified as Lithuanian or Slavonic or Romanian or Finnish, with subnotes that those four races are hard to tell apart but are really important to tell apart. And it has some sort of anti Semitic things about how to classify people who are identified with the Hebrew race, um, and talks briefly about people from India and Southeast Asia, and basically says the United States does not receive enough immigrants from that part of the world for it to be important for you to know anything about them. Um, so that's that manual. What I really want you to remember from that is the sane insane distinction. The next manual in the genealogy of the DSM is a book called Medical 203. Medical 203 was produced during World War II. And the effort that was put into the national mobilization of psychiatrists for the purpose of evaluating military recruits in their mental health was responsible for the movement of the national consciousness of what it meant for a person to have a mental disorder, sort of out of the asylum a little bit. Um, and like I said, the previous statistical manual was written with the environment of mental institutions taken for granted as the context for understanding mental illness. The research that was taking place during World War II with these psychiatrists is what produced Medical 203, which was a military manual for mental health diagnostics. In the introduction to Medical 203, it describes itself as the best nosology for mental disorder classification. I'll talk about that word a little bit more in a minute, nosology. And it acknowledges that the previous manuals were tainted with bias and bad theory. For example, it gives the old diagnosis of hysteria and explains how this term had accumulated all sorts of nonsense associations and has become something ridiculous and non useful. Um, what Medical 203 does do is it offers kind of Freudian style psychoanalysis as the default scientific theory by which neurosis should be understood. And this is the term that they start using a lot in this time, neurosis. Um, and when we get this term nosology, the actual definition of the word nosology is, put simply, a system for disease classification. But what we mean when we refer to nosology in reference to the evolution of the DSM, people usually are talking about a theory-based approach towards mental health classification, and that would be as opposed to like evidence-based medicine. Psychoanalysis was theory-based, a theory-based approach towards mental health classification. The psychoanalytic school had put forth a theory of human cognition, which became accepted as a kind of fact for a period of time, particularly through the mid 20th century. And the ways that mental health diagnoses were classified during that time was powerfully shaped by psychoanalytic theory. Um, the APA was inspired by Medical 203 and decided that it was time to create a diagnostic manual for the public. And that's when they produced the first DSM, DSM-1, which they published in 1952. And with just some really minor changes, it wasn't significantly different than Medical 203. Some of the entries were identical. For most intents and purposes, it was just an updated version of the same manual. DSM-2 came out in 1968 and was not that different than DSM-1. There were just some minor wording changes and the removal and addition of a few diagnoses, but there wasn't a very big change in the way that psychiatric diagnosis was imagined. But during the tenure of DSM-2, there was a beginning of a change in how mental health was imagined. There was a transition period that was marked by one of the more significant changes in the history of the DSM, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we're talking about PTSD. But it is important in the history of the DSM. That was the delisting of homosexuality as a mental disorder. One of the major things that inspired this was the observation that outside of the context of cultural oppression, non heteronormative people could live lives that were completely functional. And this was sort of like one of the first stages of psychiatric diagnostics taking a turn away from theory based nosology towards evidence based medicine. But there was an enormous backlash within the APA when this decision was being made, and the psychiatrists who dissented against the delisting of homosexuality managed to replace it with a new diagnosis, which showed up in an updated version of the DSM. And what I mean by that is between DSMs, there will be updated versions sometimes. So, like between DSM-2 and DSM-3, there's a DSM-2R. Between 3 and 4, there's a DSM-3R. And those revisions are still within the same kind of model as of the DSM, but with some changes that they decided to make. So they came out with DSM-2R and created a new diagnosis called sexual orientation disturbance. To make a long story short, they decided that homosexuality would no longer be considered a mental disorder. However, they would still have a diagnosis available in their toolkit to give to people whose lives were profoundly disrupted by the experience of being gay. In other words, if one of their patients came to them and said that they were gay and they hated being gay and they wished that they could change, they could still be diagnosed with this kind of secondary diagnosis, sexual orientation disturbance, even though they were no longer considering homosexuality to be a mental disorder by default. This version of DSM-2 came out in 1974. But the debate over the delisting of homosexuality, along with the invention of this new diagnosis, sexual orientation disturbance, signaled to many people that there was a deep need to change how things were being done. So they decided there needed to be a new DSM that was organized by a new organizational philosophy. The task force for this creation of the new DSM was headed by a psychiatrist named Robert Spitzer. And I want you to remember Robert Spitzer. He has been called the most influential psychiatrist of the late 20th century. And Spitzer had a vision. He saw everything that was problematic in this process that happened during DSM-2 when homosexuality was delisted and then sexual orientation disturbance came along. And his goal was to distill psychiatry from problematic value judgments. One thing that he did was he cleared the DSM committee of every psychiatrist who was involved in the production of DSM-2. He wanted to have a brand new team, and the second big thing that he did was he demanded that all psychiatric diagnoses be understandable and describable through the philosophy of German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin. Emil Kraepelin was a late 19th century and early 20th century German psychiatrist and was an early advocate for the humane treatment of institutionalized patients. He considered the treatment of institutionalized people to be barbaric, and he also considered the various theories that were used to explain mental illness to be pseudoscience. His primary intervention in the history of psychiatry was his belief that mental illness is a biological pathology. He was a colleague of Alois Alzheimer, which is a good example. The two of them co-discovered what we now call Alzheimer's disease, and Kraepelin was the one who gave it that name. Like Alzheimer's disease, Kraepelin believed that all mental illness could be shown to have a biological base rather than being based in social theory. And he believed that recognizing the biological basis of mental illness would protect patients from unfair judgment and abuse. Kraepelinian analysis is based on three concepts: analogy to physical disease, observation of visible phenomena, in other words, evidence-based medicine rather than theory, and the belief that research will eventually reveal organic or biochemical origins for mental disorders. Uh, in other words, even if the biochemical and physiological mechanisms could not be understood in his day, he believed that one day, with technological advancements, that we would be able to explain how all mental disorders are related to biology and neurological processes in the brain and behaving in the same way as physical diseases. Again, this represents a turn away from theory-based nosology towards evidence-based medicine. And using evidence-based medicine with homosexuality as the case in point, the diagnosis does not stand up to scrutiny. So when DSM-3 was published in 1980, both homosexuality and sexual orientation disturbance were removed. DSM-3 was also the version of the DSM that featured PTSD for the first time. But I want to say a couple more things about Robert Spitzer and DSM-3. I mentioned that the work that he did on DSM-3, among other things, made him be considered a very, very influential psychiatrist. And this is complicated. The process that we just described, talking about the implementation of Kraepelinian analysis and nudging psychiatric diagnoses towards evidence-based medicine, are prime examples of what we've talked about in this class when we talk about medicalization, just like in the article that we read about it in the class. This includes the movement of a lot of what used to be considered social problems into the realm of biomedicine. A flip side of this is that things that cannot be classified as biomedical very easily end up becoming known as social problems. And Spitzer was very involved in the delisting of homosexuality, which made him a gay rights icon for a while, but his method backfired on him eventually. In the 1990s, Spitzer did a study and he published a paper. Without imagining that it would do so, the paper he published ended up becoming the primary scientific study that was cited in the creation of gay conversion therapy clinics. To make a long story short, his paper included a survey where he'd done several interviews and included a number of people who claimed that after extensive social pressure and using their own willpower, they managed to change their own sexual orientation from gay to straight. So after Spitzer published this paper, it caused outrage. In the queer community, people who underwent gay conversion therapy wrote Spitzer personal letters telling them about how they were abused during this therapy and how the therapists who were abusing them were citing his work and above all else, his work above all else to justify their actions. Spitzer, he was horrified when this happened. So he wrote the journal that published his paper and told them that with further consideration, he saw flaws in his own reasoning. And he saw some things he had not considered, such as the social factors that might encourage someone to tell him things that they were telling him during interviews. And he asked the journal to please retract his article. However, the journal refused. The journal claimed that the editors and several peer reviewers had scrutinized his paper. They considered his science and they considered his conclusions to be completely sound, and they can't retract the paper unless his account could be shown to be false. As in, he had like knowingly or accidentally given them information that just was not true, and he couldn't provide that. So what Spitzer ended up doing was writing a public letter apologizing to everyone who was hurt by gay conversion therapy, and he died shortly afterwards. Spitzer championed evidence-based medicine. He hoped to do away with the abuse of social theory that harms people. However, we also see the negative side effects of the work that he did, being unable to undo the fact that by the standards of evidence-based medicine, something might be considered scientifically sound that you might be able to recognize on some level as just wrong. We see a similar thing having happened with Kraepelin, the German psychiatrist that Spitzer cited. Um, Kraepelin championed the notion of a biological basis to mental illness because he believed that doing so was going to protect patients from abuse and invalidate bad social theory. However, late in his life, in early 20th century Germany, his own thoughts started to migrate in not good ways that might be predictable within the social context of early 20th century Germany. For example, Kraepelin believing mental illness to be biological in origin, he felt compelled to account for the apparently disproportionate instance of mental illness in his Jewish patients. And he started to believe that Jewish culture was disproportionately domestic, preventing natural selection from selecting out negative traits associated with mental illness and resulting in a genetically inferior population of people. And 20 years after his death, we know where that kind of thought ended up going. Um, so moving on, when you look at the DSM, like the reading that I gave you, what you'll see is an extensive listing of mental disorders. You will see a diagnosis like schizophrenia, a list of diagnostic criteria, associated features, the prevalence of a condition, culture and gender related diagnostic issues, which that's new in DSM-5. You see suicide risk, differential diagnosis, like how do we tell this is this instead of that, and the comorbidities that might be observed. Um, so we're talking a little bit about schizophrenia, but ultimately we're just trying to understand the anthropology of mental health diagnosis more broadly. Um, so something like diagnostic criteria, we see that for a person to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, they have to have two of the following conditions for a period of at least 1 month. And at least one of these has to be the first, second, or third. delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. So they have to have the right combination of these things. So if a person has delusions and negative symptoms, schizophrenia. Grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior and negative symptoms does not equal schizophrenia. Hallucinations alone does not equal schizophrenia. Also, the presence of bipolar disorder symptoms or psychoactive substances can rule out schizophrenia. Autism spectrum disorder can rule out schizophrenia unless the delusions and hallucinations are very prominent. So it's an interesting way that these pieces get moved around to determine whether or not a person is or is not considered to be suffering from schizophrenia. The diagnostic features include a range of cognitive, behavioral, and emotional dysfunctions, but there's no single symptom listed that says, yes, this person has schizophrenia. It involves the recognition of a constellation of signs and symptoms associated with impaired occupational or social functioning. And individuals with the disorder will vary substantially on lots of the features. It's a heterogeneous clinical syndrome. The entry continues. I'm not going to read it word for word, but it basically says that for a person to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, the person has to experience substantial impairment in one of the stated major areas of functioning. The major areas of functioning are work, interpersonal relations, and self-care. So what do we say about someone who has the correct combination of symptoms to produce the schizophrenia diagnosis, but you're not able to say that that person's work, interpersonal relations, or self-care are suffering because of the condition? Then we have a little bit more of a gray area in our description of that. So we see here how this diagnosis works. It's very biomedical. Instead of theory about how the mental disorder came to be, which is what you get with psychoanalysis, we get a list of symptoms and diagnostic criteria. And if I didn't explain it before, psychoanalysis, that form of mental disorder classification, nosology, is based on the theory that our 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 psychologies are driven by conflicts between our conscious and unconscious minds, and that we are always trying to resolve things between those, and our life experiences affect the way that we do that. So, through a very psychoanalytic nosology, mental disorders are classified as being a product of those kinds of processes. So, the psychoanalytic approach to mental disorders will say a person has this mental disorder, and here is the way that these psychological processes, generally as described by Freud and others, end up producing this. And then that creates the mental disorder itself, while the evidence-based medicine approach doesn't really use any theory to describe how a mental disorder comes into being. Rather, it describes what the condition is, what symptoms you should look for, what are the patterns between these different symptoms that show that this is what the person is suffering for. Very much the same way that you would analyze a physical disease, diagnosing someone with pneumonia, for example. We could ask the question, are all mental orders experienced universally? And that's a good context for us to transition out of talking about the DSM, but I'll talk about that a little bit. I'll go back to the DSM when we're talking about PTSD. I do want to introduce a couple of more terms, but I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, and I'm going to try to break these lectures down into shorter digestible segments so you can watch them all at once, or you can spread them out if you need to. So I'll be back with that later.